We know that preserving our economy to come out of this is going to make us stronger. And we know that we're going to need to face up to those challenges. And we also recognize that raising taxes is not what Canadians want us to do.
Bill Morneau says it's not for Ottawa to raise taxes to pay for the pandemic and its response to the pandemic, but does say that Canada, as you heard there, will have to face up to some challenges ahead. So what are the political costs that come with this rising debt? And does the federal government need to be more transparent about its fiscal plan, where we're at now? It's Thursday, and I'm here with At Issue, Chantal Hébert, Andrew Coyne, and Althea Raj. Good to see everybody dialing in there. Let's start with how a government looks at potentially $1 trillion in debt, certainly more than $300 billion in deficit. What kind of political challenges does this sort of pose for a government at this stage, or are they not really even contemplating that right now, do you think, Chantal?
I don't think we're there yet. For sure, it's looming on their minds. It's looming on the minds of Canadians, what the economy will look like and what fiscal sheets for all governments will look like. But I think we are not there yet, and I don't think the federal government is there yet. I think that's probably proper because we are not out of the woods, and there are so many unknown variables that the only thing you can know for sure is it's going to be bad. That being said, politically, it's going to impact on the thinking about when you go to the polls. Do you try to go quickly when we exit this? Or if you wait, do you end up having to go when you're starting to inflict pain on taxpayers? Because that will happen.
Because it also dramatically changes anything that they were, well, not anything, but some of the things they were elected to do in the first place, Andrew, because there's no way they can now move forward with some of those big promises as well.
If there's any kind of budget constraint at all, yes. It's tempting to say right now that it's basically infinite. I mean, every couple of weeks we get a new estimate of the deficit that adds about $100 billion to it, which used to be an unheard of sum for the deficit on a whole. So $300 billion at this point is probably an underestimate. So we are looking at not just 1 year of massive deficit like that, but you can't just slam on the brakes right away. We're looking at large deficits, probably in excess of 5% of GDP for years to come, and therefore mounting debts. And we get pretty quickly on pretty safe assumptions up to the 60% debt to GDP ratio, which is where we were at back in the 90s. So we'd like to see, I guess, some evidence that the government is at least aware of this, that it has some sense of how it's going to deal with that. I understand that it's very hard to predict things in the short term, but at least some indication of that the government is aware and grasps the size of this and what its broad outlook and attempt to come to grips with that is. Is it okay with that? Is it okay with deficits of $300 billion continually? Is it going to make these short-term programs, in fact, short-term, or are they just going to segue into stimulus programs afterwards? We need some sort of indication of how the government views this.
Well, they don't seem to think right now that these programs, Althea, are in any way contributing to some sort of structural deficit, that this is really just sort of one time or, just this period of time anyway kind of spending. And once they're out of it, they'll be able to deal with all the things we're talking about.
Yeah, I would say
that was a great response, actually.
If it weighs heavily on their minds, they have given us no indication of that. They've in fact even said that the parliamentary budget officer's count is like, well, that's great that he's doing that exercise, but those are projection and who knows what it's going to cost. And right now we're just basically shoveling money out the door and not really caring how much the tally is at the end of that period of time. I think I'm not sure that this will impede their ability to do a lot of the things that they campaigned on. For example, national pharmacare. If you're already $1 trillion in debt, I mean, that's crazy. That's like American numbers. Why not add a few $1 billion more and do pharmacare? I think that this will actually give them perhaps cover to do some bigger spending things that they might otherwise not have done. But I completely agree with Chantal's point about the election.
Yeah.
The timing where the pain starts to happen will impact.
Chantal, go ahead. Yeah, you went in there.
So what about the proposition that being transparent is saying that you don't know because you don't? And
that would be refreshing, wouldn't it?
But that is kind of the message. I don't for a second believe that this federal government is looking for cover to spend billions of dollars on pet projects. But I do believe that they know that, yes, they could come up with a fiscal update. It would probably be welcome. But at some point, there is no way to say, we're going to stop giving you people who are out on the street and who we put out on the street and you companies that we stopped, we're going to stop this and set a date, because that's when we need to set a date. Everyone knows it's not sustainable. But to have this conversation now and to judge the government's lack of concern on the basis of today is premature.
Okay, Andrew,
Just very quickly, the notion that this is just a one and done, we'll run one big deficit and then we'll get back to normal because we'll be able to ramp down spending. First of all, presumes that we will ramp down spending the way we did after World War II, for example. And I think that's really very much in doubt. But secondly, it ignores the fact that we haven't just ramped up spending, we've had a big hit on revenues. So even if we could, and even if we were a mind to cut spending all the way back, we still have this huge revenue hole from the fall off in revenues, and that cannot be made up that easily.
No, especially if you've got businesses shuttering, which is what the governor of the Bank of Canada said today is going to start happening at some point here. It also presumes that this federal government would be uncomfortable with a large debt load. They certainly haven't been uncomfortable with a deficit. So maybe they just won't even bother to tackle it. Is that a realistic thing to contemplate too, Althea?
No, I don't think so. I think there will be pressure to show that there is some sort of fiscal responsibility that still exists within the Liberal Party. I think that government could do a far better job of being transparent. I just want to go back on that other point, because they haven't even said that they're pledging to have a fiscal update or some sort of financial document before the end of the year. Like, I think people understand that a budget is not coming next week. It takes manpower that they just do not have. Those people have been busy doing these announcements and these big spending things that normally are probably worth several budgets. But the idea that, the government still deserves to show that they're being fiscally responsible, that accountability should exist, like, it has not actually said and been transparent about, these are the reasons why we can't do this at this time. I think the public would benefit from having that. It would be refreshing.
Chantal,
but I do think that when we... Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead, Chantal. Yep.
I think that they believe that the reasons why they can't come up with a plan or even a fiscal update that will tell you that, or they think those reasons are obvious. Maybe they're not, but that is what they think. I don't think they're hiding something, and I'm willing to wager two things. We will see a fiscal update or something before the end of the year, and the GST will go up before I am finished paying taxes on goods and services.
Well, there you go. Bill Morneau said he wasn't going to do it, but there you go.
That's Chantal's way. He's not doing it. Not today, but he will do it.
All right.
Yeah,
okay.
I didn't hear him say no. I heard him say
never.
We're not doing it right now.
He didn't
That's
say
fair.
never.
Okay, that's fair. All right. Okay, let's move on to another issue that came up multiple times this week, and that is around fraudulent CERB claims. Here's what the Prime Minister had to say about that today.
We needed to help them rapidly and efficiently. That means to get the CERB, people simply needed to fill out an attestation to make commitments that they were in a situation that they deserved to get the CERB. Of course, there's going to be a few people who will misrepresent themselves and try and defraud the situation. Defraud the situation. But we know that the priority was getting help to people who needed it.
So that was probably the answer where the Prime Minister has been the clearest, I would say, about the fact that they understand that some people are taking advantage of this. But they've also told my colleague Catherine Cullen, the CRA has said to her that it's a very small percentage, maybe 2 to 3%, which is slightly higher than it would usually be because there's so little needed to apply for it. Was that the right way, though, for a government to manage something like this, to try to back-end load any kind of verification that needs to be done? I'll start with you, Chantal.
Yes, because there were people who were facing rent mortgages who were suddenly put on the streets. And to make the kind of checks that would make it foolproof would actually take more time and would mean the money wouldn't be getting to the people who actually need it. This is a program that was put together in record speed. Governments do not usually do stuff like this. And as a taxpayer with long experience, I do have some faith in Revenue Canada's capacity to catch up to people later, further down the road.
Andrew.
Yes, this is a program designed for the short term, and in the short term, in the emergency that we were and are in, you basically have to just take it. You're going to have a certain amount of fraud and waste in that program. There are other problems with the program in terms of work incentives, et cetera. So as you start to think about programs for the longer term, then you can start to address and tighten these things up and try to make them more fraud-proof and try to make them more improve work incentives. But in the short-term emergency, you just couldn't worry about that.
Okay, maybe we'll come back to that, but I'll get Althea to weigh in on first on whether you think this was the right way to handle things or not.
I think they needed to get money out of the door quickly, and there is no way that they could have sent out checks by doing adequate verification of everybody's individual cases, for sure. I think confusion reigns over people who are not sure whether or not they should apply, and the government, again, has been less than transparent when they're asked very clear questions by reporters. For example, if I don't feel safe going to work, can I decline and still collect CERB? The government has still, to this point, has refused to answer that question. And I think the other question that the Conservatives have been asking about all week is, well, what about this, directive that you're giving public servants that they should turn a blind eye when they find cases that they think are abuses of the system? And the government has been less than clear about that, and even is suggesting that maybe they are kind of postponing going after people or preventing people from accessing benefits that they maybe are not entitled to.
Can I just go back to a point that Andrew was making? I'll start with you, Andrew, and that is, at what point do you roll this back? Because it did sound to me, when I was talking to Bill Morneau yesterday, that they were looking for some way to shift the people. Obviously, their goal is to shift anyone on CERB onto the wage subsidy program, so employers take on some of the cost. But it also sounded like they were looking for a way to transform the CERB into the EI system, and I wonder if you think that makes sense, and if that can get them, I guess, where they want to go, which is to have more people sort of off their payroll and back into businesses and into their jobs.
Again, it depends how ambitious you want to be. A lot of people would say, well, actually, what you should be doing is transferring EI into some kind of guaranteed income, and this could be the seeds of that. We talked about that last time. That's a much more ambitious, potentially much more expensive program, and would run you into all kinds of difficulties with the provinces. It has some merit in terms of the overall principle, but would have a lot of practical difficulties of implementation. So yes, I would imagine the government would like to get out of the CERB game as soon as it practically and compassionately can. But EI was overwhelmed in the immediacy again of this crisis. But I'm not one of those who says, well, therefore EI has proven itself to be a bogus program. It has always needed reforms, and maybe this will spur them.
Chantal, your thoughts on that?
I don't think that they can make a structural move meant to last until we are done with this crisis. I also don't think they can walk away from CERB or those temporary programs until Canada's larger cities, Montreal, Toronto, are up to a point going back to normal, and that would involve a capacity for people to go to work. It's not just being scared of physical danger. If you can't get childcare or schools or day camps, you have a problem here. And I think a government that keeps talking about gender equality cannot afford to send the message, well, it's okay, women who tend to have the lesser paid jobs should just give up on working.
Okay, last word to Althea on this.
Yeah, I can't see them doing that. What they've talked about is possibly extending the programs even come September. I think we may be less likely to see CERB moving into EI, but the wage subsidy, the proportion lowers, so employers take a bigger toll and the federal government takes a less expensive toll. Because moving people from CERB to the wage subsidy is actually moving them into a more generous program.
That's right.
And then you also have the problem with CERB being, people are just possibly going to lie about like how they've earned a little bit more income and say that they, maybe made $1,000 instead of $1,200, and then they can't qualify for $2,000. So I think a lot of thought is being given to how can they phase things out so people are not hit disproportionately and unfairly when, the economy is not operating at full capacity.
Okay, really smart conversation. Thank you all very much. I'll see you next week.